have my slides, please. It is the great honor of the President-elect to introduce the President each year. I am truly humbled by the opportunity to present our President, Daniel G. Coit, MD. Dr. Coit was born in Waterbury, Connecticut. His parents, Charlie and Eileen, his father, both deceased now. His father was a secondary school teacher. His mother raised the children. You can see his parents at their wedding. He grew up in Washington, Connecticut, went to the local day school there, Rumsey Hall, and then attended Phillips Academy. Dan and his siblings, who are all here, his entire family is here in attendance at our meeting this morning, pictured here in their happy New England childhood upbringing. Dan is the eldest. Yeah. And in talking to Dan, it's clear that a formative experience was their year spent in France for their father's sabbatical when in 1959 to 1960, when Dan was 10 years old. The kids all went to a different French school. They spent all their weekends in a Volkswagen bus touring all of Western Europe. During his childhood, they spent their summers sailing in a 50-year-old schooner in New England. And what Dan says about his family and his siblings is that they always had the unwavering support of his parents. They learned the attributes of absolute equanimity, the unanticipated value of adventure, and new experiences. I think you'll see that come to fruition here. He worked in the summer jobs as delivering newspapers, as a sailing instructor, a yacht broker, a yacht rigger, and during college he did everything from being a building custodian, a bartender, a short order cook. He ran the school birthday cake agency and was, of course, again, a sailing instructor. He appeared to be a rather serious and pensive youth, as you can see in these photographs. But nothing brought him happiness and joy quite like lederhosen. This joy was undiminished later in life when he got to don once again fine leathern garments. Dan was a brilliant student. He was admitted to Yale as a Yale National Scholar. He attended University of Cincinnati Medical School and graduated AOA, did his internship at Boston City Hospital, residency at New England Deaconess, spent a year in Scotland at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, and fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, here seen with his residency class. There was some controversy about which side his hair should be parted on during his formative years, which finally settled on early adulthood on the left side. Dr. Weigel's introduction of Dr. Michelasi was much more distinguished than this. You probably should have had him introduce you. Dr. Coit is truly a consummate academic surgical oncologist. He has published 309 papers, 22 book chapters, has given 72 invited lectures, has had NCI and other funding to support his research. He's on the editorial board of 3 journals. He's been chief of the gastric and mixed tumor service at Memorial, co-leader of the gastric and melanoma disease management teams, director of surgical oncology education at Memorial, has been a leader in the staging committees of the AJCC for both melanoma and gastric cancer, and a leader in the NCCN as well, has served as treasurer and many other leadership roles at the Society of Surgical Oncology. But who is our president? He is a loving husband. You can see him pictured here, Kate and Dan at their wedding, and their honeymoon was spent sailing around the coast of Maine, a topic that apparently is still raises a little controversy 35 years later. I love these pictures of Dan and Kate during their time in Scotland. You can see the beautiful Kate here. You can see that they're truly in love, and a love that remains undiminished throughout their lifetime. You can see many happy adventures, and Dan always seems happiest in the presence of Kate. Our president is a family man, a dedicated family man. You can see him here with his children David and Caroline during their many family vacations and adventures around the world, and especially sailing. Here with us today also are Dan and Kate's children, Caroline and husband John, and David and fiance Jackie, seen pictured here, Caroline and John at her wedding last year, and David and Jackie. Our president is fun-loving. You can see the many fun times they've had, and again, he lights up when Kate is by his side. He is an outdoorsman. Many other adventures: skiing, hiking, adventuring, fishing, sailing. Our president is a rugged adventurer, undaunted by nature and willing to row out into the ocean, or accompanied occasionally by a canine companion. Apparently, he's a distinguished and accomplished tennis player. Here you can see him at Rod Laver Arena being cheered on by the sold-out crowd. He is a fisherman. You can see the delight he takes in outdoor activities, and fishing is certainly one of the highlights. I mean, look how happy he is here. It looks like he stole that fish. But most of all, our president is a master surgeon and surgical educator. He truly is the consummate academic surgical oncologist, descended from the line of Murray Brennan and many other distinguished surgeons at Memorial, where he spent his entire career. He is known for his surgical education, his dedication to education, and the rigorous standards to which he holds the trainees for scientific thought, logical thought, and evidence-based medicine. Truly a master surgeon and expert, world expert in the fields of melanoma and gastric cancer. But always, it's important to recognize that Dr. Coit's true love beyond his family is of the sea. His house in Maine, and we were fortunate to have the SSO leadership retreat at their home in Maine last year. It was truly a delightful experience, and to see how much our president loves his time that he spends there, and his time sailing and on the ocean. Always drawn back to the sea. In fact, he's going to sail around Newfoundland for the entire summer, a daunting task, but he is clearly an expert master sailor, and this will be a highlight of his entire life. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you husband, father, sailor, outdoorsman, surgeon, and friend, our 70th president of the Society of Surgical Oncology, Daniel G. Coit.
I'm going to quit I'm gonna stop right here. We're all gonna have an early coffee break. I don't think I can top that. Members and guests, which is how this talk is supposed to begin, but what I'd like to say is many, many friends and family. I'm going to talk about surgical oncologists and the society and the profession. This presidential address was to the Society of Surgical Oncology was born 51 years ago and is best described in this excerpt taken from Dr. Glenn Leake's inaugural address. At a meeting of the SSO Executive Council in January of this year, 1966, it was voted that an annual message should be presented and received by members of this society by the President. The vote, needless to say, was not unanimous. There were 2 nay votes, one by the President and the second by the President-elect, who is already worrying about what he's going to say next year. I can't speak for Kelly, but I can say that for me, after the inevitability of the task set in, I've been very much looking forward to this opportunity to share with you some of my reflections on the past, present, and future of the profession in general, the professionals who inhabit this profession, and the societies into which they have congregated. In the 6 years since past President Petrelli, try to say that 6 times fast, called to inform me that I had been selected to be the SSO treasurer, and hence on a trajectory towards this podium on this St. Patrick's Day, I have had the unique privilege of interacting and learning from the extraordinary staff, leadership, and members of this absolutely first-class organization. I've been afforded the opportunity to represent our society to the international community dedicated to improving surgical care of cancer patients worldwide. These experiences have served to strongly reinforce how fortunate we all are to be in this room at this time. I'm going to come back to that sentiment a little bit later in the talk. Looking back at the tone and content of the previous 44 published presidential addresses has been quite informative. While none of the talks have embraced all of these characteristics, some common themes have clearly emerged. Presidential addresses can be hysterical, inspirational, aspirational, entertaining, humorous, gracious, memorable, that one's the most difficult, thought-provoking, personal, and most importantly, personal. Some of them were actually pretty confusing to read, and most of them, in general, wore better in print than they did in presentation. Just a short anecdote to describe that last sentiment. This latter observation is best addressed up front by recalling the fellow who had traveled over 3 hours one very cold Maine winter night through a blinding blizzard to address a local town assembly. And he started off by saying, and I'm not going to do the Maine accent, I very much appreciate that we've all gone to a great deal of effort to be here tonight. As I understand it, my job is to talk and your job is to listen. I do hope you will do me the courtesy of letting me know if you finish up before I do. I'm hoping that you guys in the audience are friends enough of mine to afford me the same courtesy. So as recorded so beautifully and comprehensively by past President Charles Balch in his 3-part history of the 75-year history of the first 75 years of the SSO, our organization has navigated an extraordinary voyage to this point. The pace of change for the profession, the professionals, and the society continues to accelerate at an exhilarating rate. In the context of this change, any forecasting of what lies ahead is not only bound to be inaccurate, but also subject to ruthless future scrutiny once committed to print. So I guess we're simply going to have to rely on the inarguable wisdom of the most famous Yankee catcher of all, Yogi Berra, who has never once been contradicted with his observation that the future ain't what it used to be. Surgical oncology, the profession of surgical oncology began as the domain of surgeons who operated on cancer patients in an era when there were few, if any, alternatives to primary tumor resection. At a time when preoperative imaging was in its infancy, clinical staging and preoperative risk stratification were based on clinical observations and judgment alone, often at the expense of what we would now consider to be inappropriate patient care. There was a time not so long ago when bigger operations were considered to be better operations, even at the expense of increased immediate morbidity and mortality. Our understanding of the role of regional lymph nodes and the outcome of various diseases was, and in some cases still is, very much oversimplified, to the point where the ability to perform a thorough lymphadenectomy was often used as a criterion to distinguish the surgical oncologist from a general surgeon. Our ability to impact the long-term outcome of patients with distant metastatic disease was even less well understood. Over time, careful recording of outcomes, either in large clinical databases or prospective clinical trials, has helped to define the natural history of this very polymorphous and enigmatic disease, and to refine our understanding of the role, our role as surgeons in cancer, with respect to primary tumor, regional lymph nodes, and distant metastases. For the most part, we have learned from multiple large prospective clinical trials that once the tumor is completely removed, removal of additional normal tissue is rarely associated with any metric of improved outcome. In fact, in some cancers, such as early thyroid or prostate cancer, we're becoming comfortable with the concept that not every diagnosis of cancer requires immediate or, in fact, any treatment at all. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have identified and continue to expand indications for prophylactic removal of clinically normal organs to remove or eliminate future mortality based solely on genetic identification of risk. We have learned through multiple large prospective clinical trials across multiple tumor types that elective removal of clinically uninvolved regional or extraregional lymph nodes has little, if any, impact on the outcome of patients with a broad array of solid tumors. And the extraordinary thing about this is the remarkable unanimity of these findings. And finally, we've learned that we're much more likely to alter the arc of tumor progression if resection of distant metastases is offered to patients who have selected themselves with a history of indolent oligometastatic disease, particularly in the presence or as an adjunct to effective systemic therapy, something we're now beginning to appreciate as adjuvant surgery. Yet in grouping all patients with malignancy of a similar organ together to be treated in a similar fashion, we are inevitably failing to recognize the enormous inherent biologic heterogeneity of a given tumor. Gastric cancer is a perfect example, where tumors that appear vastly different, either histologically or genetically, are all treated the same. And I'd like to share with you some information we haven't seen before. This is the progress that we've made in gastric cancer over the last 30 years at MSKCC, the span of my surgical career. While one might argue that a small proportion of patients with more advanced disease might have been downstage by the recent application of neoadjuvant therapy, the inevitable conclusion of these curves here, and I think in large part addressed by some of the abstracts we heard this morning, is that once the operation is over, the die is cast. It is exceedingly unlikely that we're going to change the shape of these survival curves by devoting more resources or refining more expensive technology to remove more and more lymph nodes through smaller and smaller incisions. This kind of thinking must stop. It has certainly changed in melanoma, as you heard yesterday from Dr. Walchuk. While survival after surgical resection of stages 0, 1, 2, and 3 melanoma has remained largely stable at our institution over the last 20 years. With the inhibition of BRAF-mutated tumors, one of the abstracts we heard today, and durable response seen after immune checkpoint blockade therapy, look at what has happened to the shape of survival curves for stage 4 melanoma patients in the modern era. It is completely different. The future of surgical oncology truly lies in embracing, recognizing, and characterizing the heterogeneity of the tumors we treat. The discovery of predictive and prognostic biomarkers will be founded on creation of large, collaborative, meticulous, clinically annotated biospecimen banks. Our profession is uniquely positioned to provide high-quality, analytic, fresh and frozen tissue, even as the technology to interrogate that tissue continues to expand at an exponential rate. From this foundation, we will begin the process of studying the outliers. The patient with very early stage disease who recurred and died, and the patient with local regionally advanced disease who has remained alive and well, often with nothing beyond surgical resection alone. We've got to discover the genes, the dynamic epigenetic factors, the metabolomics, the microbiology, the immunology, the host factors that drive these unexpected clinical outcomes. And once we understand the complex interactive processes that promote tumor development and progression, we need to continue to discover which of these processes are critical drivers, and of those, which can be effectively manipulated with an acceptable risk-benefit ratio, much of what Jed was talking about yesterday. We will learn which patients with localized disease are at risk for recurrence and require further treatment, and we will learn about patients like this. We will learn for which patients lymph nodes are indicators and for which patients they are determinants of outcome. And beyond the known clinical factors, we must better select patients for resection of metastatic disease and improve on Don Morton's classic ringing endorsement of surgery as the ultimate form of immunotherapy. How do we as surgical oncologists who inhabit this remarkable profession best carry forward the traditions of the past into the incomprehensible promise of the future? As I look out on this talented and dedicated audience today, I expect it really won't be all that difficult. It will be our task, as it always has been, to set the bar of excellence high, maybe to a level we imagine to be just out of reach, so that each and every one of us will strive every day to be a bit better in all domains. We will continue to render the most humane, rational, evidence-based care, and when evidence is lacking, and it often is, we will confer and discuss and research and exercise our very best judgment. Our care will be precise and humane, and we will be ever mindful of how critically important what we do and say, and particularly how we do and say it, is to those patients and families we serve. We will continue the endlessly rewarding process of educating our next generation, equipping them not only with facts and techniques, but also with an impeccable sense of professionalism. We will show them how to be critically analytic and how to effectively use their skills to build new tools to solve challenges that are beyond the realm of our current imagination. And we will help them to formulate a personal philosophy of surgical oncology. We will emphasize the essential trait of their being able to modify that philosophy when new facts are revealed. We must show them the absolute folly of clinging to outdated concepts when they are no longer sustainable. As a corollary to this, we must embrace the time-consuming obligation to participate in the ever-growing peer review process. We must acknowledge that even the most sophisticated statistics cannot assign causality to the many associations seen in retrospective reviews. We are the final bastion responsible for protecting and preserving the objective credibility of the published literature. We must always let the data speak to us completely unencumbered by pre-existing biases. I think we need to bring a new energy and design to prospective clinical trials. A topic of one of the great debates later today, in my estimation, the lumbering and resource-intense prospective randomized clinical trial methodology needs to be overhauled or perhaps abandoned. Elegantly simple in concept, the prospective randomized clinical trial simply has too many faults. The results are often neither reproducible nor applicable outside of the stringent conditions defining the test populations. And I use this example as to illustrate this. Two very rigorously performed PRCTs, each one having an investigator that was a prior president of the SSO, looking at the use of drains after pancreatic duodenectomy. This first one clearly showed that closed drainage suction should not be considered mandatory, while this more recent one finally produced class 1 information that you have to use drains. So what are we supposed to do? These trials mandate lumping patients together into defined test cohorts. Even the most skilled stratification cannot begin to accommodate the infinite biologic heterogeneity that is lost in that process. Statistically significant differences in outcome between two groups tell us little, if anything, about how best to treat an individual patient. When looking at therapeutic trials, an absolute difference of 10% in two arms means necessarily that 90% of patients in receiving the treatment will derive no benefit. They will either recur and die despite the treatment, or they will live with the treatment. Now, this is particularly important when the adjuvant therapy involves substantial financial or potentially life-altering toxicity, and when the treatment may be even more effectively administered only to those patients who recur, as may be the case with the adjuvant immunotherapy trial we heard about yesterday. Now, these last concepts are particularly important because we as surgeons in the room are the gatekeepers about discussions of adjuvant therapy before or after resection. There are 4 principles that we must present with unflinching accuracy as we discuss adjuvant therapy with our patients. What is the absolute risk of recurrence to be addressed by that particular therapy? What is the absolute, not relative risk reduction of the treatment? What is the cost of the treatment in the broadest sense? And what are the salvage options in the event that the patient does recur without adjuvant therapy? We have to be prepared to provide the most precise probabilities. The patient should help decide the decision thresholds. And even as we must embrace new technology, especially that technology which addresses predefined unmet needs, we should never be seduced by it. New technology should be subjected to the same rigorous scrutiny we reserve for drugs and biologics. Finally, I'd like to talk about surgical oncology societies. These societies were initially conceived and founded on a very simple premise. You know, we should get together once a year and compare notes. Initial offers of membership would be made to extend it to some group that had something in common, generally for a very nominal fee. In fact, in the case of the SSO, born as the James Ewing Society back in 1940, the group consisted of the staff and alumni of Memorial Hospital. The annual dues at that time were $5. After a few years of working out bylaws and a couple of years off for the war, the very first Annual Cancer Symposium was held at the old Memorial Hospital in 1948, in fact, the year before I was born. And at that meeting, Elizabeth Quimby, a pioneering radiologist interested in calculating dosimetry of therapeutic radiation, presented the initial James Ewing lecture on the history of cancer research. Imagine what she would have thought sitting here listening to the talk that Jed Wolchuk gave yesterday. Fascinating. Time does not permit a detailed review of the important landmark events that have gotten us here today, so I will simply summarize them on this slide. But as a direct result of the tireless efforts of a gifted and totally dedicated and usually overworked staff, the expertise of countless volunteers populating our committee structure, I am pleased to report to you today that the SSO over the last 5 years since moving to self-management has never been in better shape. Our staffing continues to grow. Our infrastructure is becoming more sophisticated to support member needs and beyond. Our membership is at an all-time high. As you heard yesterday, meeting abstract submissions are at an all-time high. And meeting and attendance at this meeting is quite robust. This is the second highest attended meeting in this decade. At this year's annual meeting, over 1/4 of our residents of our attendees is a trainee, resident, or student. And this argues very strongly for the future for the successful future of this society. Nearly 1 in 5 registrants, in fact, is international, attesting to the growing global interest in this specialty. Our budgets are balanced with enormous discipline. Our assets are increasing. The array of educational opportunities offered by the Society to meet trainee and member MOC and CME needs continues to expand. Now look at this. From 2013 to 2016, the Very Active Education Division has granted nearly 52,000 CME credits to you, the members. 52,000 in 3 years. It's an extraordinary production. In fact, President-elect McMasters has proposed creation of a formal educational council to oversee and expand this growing potential in this area. The council will be supported by substantial SSO investment in software infrastructure. You heard from past President Michelasi today about the certificate in complex surgical oncology. And to date, as of 2016, 151 surgical oncologists have completed the rigorous training, written, and oral examination process to achieve that board certification. This, in turn, has been associated with a remarkable growth in the subspecialty, in our subspecialty, by the graduates of surgical residencies. Look what's happened to our applications. This clearly far exceeds our ability to accommodate it. Our international program remains robust and active with society-sponsored international exchange programs of young surgical oncologists, best of SSO programs, and reciprocal participation by leadership in international meetings. We now have formal agreements with 8 international partners. We have hosted 20 international fellows from abroad and sent 5 of our fellows to foreign observerships. So where do we go from here? One thing is very clear. As part of our history, the 80s taught us we simply cannot rest on our laurels. There are a number of very significant challenges to maintaining our current momentum. We are working in an environment of shrinking institutional and corporate dollars to support our members and programs. Other subspecialty programs are competing not only for those dollars, but also for the time and allegiance of their members. To address this, we recently convened an outreach task force chaired by Dr. Armando Giuliano to look at every aspect of domestic and international membership and how we can best meet their needs as it pertains to appropriate membership and meeting fee structures, meeting content, and access to our educational offerings. This will be a major focal point of the next strategic retreat to be convened by Dr. McMasters in Louisville next summer. To increase our visibility with domestic general surgeons, we conducted our first 90-minute 10 Hot Topics in Surgical Oncology session at the fall ACS meeting in Washington, D.C. I co-chaired this session with Dr. Tim Pollack, and in my humble estimation, due exclusively to the remarkably high-quality, quick-hit presentations by the faculty, including Tim, Andrea Barrio, George Chang, and Brian Unch. This was one of the best, most dynamic sessions I think I've ever attended. We got an enormous amount of very enthusiastic, positive feedback from an audience of over 350 people who stayed specifically to attend this next-to-last session of that meeting. We plan to repeat this with new speakers and topics in San Diego this fall, and hope to make it a standing session in the fall ACS agenda curriculum. With respect to the international program, I see so many opportunities. I think the biggest challenge will be to prioritize them within the overall context of the many other things we've got to get done to be outlined in the next strategic retreat. As I've traveled around the world this year representing the SSO in Mexico, Brazil, Europe, China, and Korea, one observation is abundantly clear. We cannot export American medicine. What we can export are some of the tools that we consider to be essential to advance the practice of surgical oncology. Dr. Ari, Dr. Berman, and Dr. Audicio have published a wonderful analysis of the state of surgical oncology training worldwide and followed up with an extraordinarily detailed modular curriculum to help address some of the disparities they found. Doctors Kantz and Hochwald are leading a collaboration of the SSO with Decker Publishing to create a comprehensive, updatable, online, point-of-service, multimedia surgical oncology textbook based on the above curriculum. I strongly urge you to stop by the booth and road test the modules that have been completed to date. Hopefully, that will be the vehicle that makes a uniform surgical oncology curriculum no farther away than the nearest internet connection. One of the many domains of excellence in the SSO's armamentarium is surgical oncology training. And it seems that the next logical step, although highly aspirational, would be to develop an SSO-approved online international surgical oncology fellowship program. This is not a new idea. Jatin Shah has created this in head and neck surgery, a highly structured, extremely rigorous, didactic, and operative online head and neck oncology fellowship program with both written and oral examinations required for certification. This year, that program, which is overseen by the International Federation of Head and Neck Oncologic Societies, certified 83 individual fellows around the world. They anticipate another 80 next year. This would require a substantial upfront commitment of time and resources, but if successful, would go a long way towards securing recognition of the SSO as the global leader in the field. And finally, the time has now come for us to make an important commitment together with domestic and international partner societies to acknowledge and engage some of the resources to begin to address the crushing burden of global cancer care in the world, and particularly the underdeveloped countries. Very much like global warming, it can be very convenient to ignore this if it doesn't affect you personally, but the statistics are daunting. Over the next 15 to 20 years, the number of new cancer cases worldwide will increase by 30% to around 24 million. 80% of these cases will require surgery as a part of their care. The global need for cancer surgery is estimated to rise to about 45 million. And here's the problem. Half of the world's population lives in low and low middle income countries. This half will disproportionately bear the mortality of this cancer epidemic. 61% of new cancer cases and 70% of cancer deaths will occur in that 50% of the world. The financial implications of the continuing to neglect these trends is completely unsustainable. Until recently, member involvement in this crisis has been sporadic and largely individual. There have been a number of past and present leaders and future leaders of the organization who have already committed substantial personal and institutional time and resources to support their commitment to global cancer care. This year, a seminal event happened. The SSO became a sponsoring organization of health volunteers overseas. This is a remarkable organization, founded about 30 years ago, committed to improving the availability of health care in developing countries. SSO membership response to their initial call for volunteers to join trips to Honduras was truly remarkable. We had 16 member inquiries for 3 available positions. So in addition to providing a mechanism for us to contribute outside of our comfortable and well-resourced U.S. borders, This sponsorship may well turn out to be an opportunity to fulfill an unmet need among our membership. Our new relationship with HVO is in its infancy, and I very much hope we can nurture its steady growth in the years ahead. There are roughly 200 countries in the world, each with its own political system, cultural norms, resource allocations, and challenges to effective healthcare delivery in general and surgical oncology specifically. Not surprisingly, access to safe surgery, shown here, is directly related to a country's available resources. If a workable solution exists for each country, and there is absolutely no guarantee that there is, there may well be more than 200 different approaches needed. We cannot and must not start out by thinking we will solve all or even a measurable fraction of the global cancer surgery challenge. But as the premier surgical oncology organization in the world, inaction is simply not an option. With or without partner societies, we must engage. It is simply the right thing to do. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. How did I get here? Why am I standing here today? I think a lot of you are probably asking the same question by now. But as I look back at the pantheon of past SSO presidents, both recent and remote, I'm prompted, as were some, but not all, past presidents, to ask why I was selected for this very special position. I'm not a surgeon scientist. I'm not a department chair, or even at this point a division chief. And then after a little bit of introspection, I realized it must have something to do with my very deep, abiding love and respect for the SSO, for all that it has already achieved in so many domains, and for that, all of that which I fully expect it will continue to achieve in the years ahead. Now, this section's a little bit longer than usual because I needed and got quite a bit more help to get here than most of our past presidents. And I'd like to acknowledge that help now, recognizing that by naming anyone, I will necessarily and unintentionally omit others. I would like to thank the SSO leadership, past, present, and future, for their hard work and incredibly generous sharing of advice and counsel over the last few years. If there is a beating heart to this organization, and there is, I'd like to thank this incredibly professional staff, assembled and led by one of the most extraordinary people I've ever had the privilege of working with, Eileen Widmer. Eileen, this started out as a professional relationship. I hope it will endure as a lifelong friendship. Please keep your hand firmly on the wheel. And you know the circumstances behind that picture. Within the field of my academic interest, I have learned more about melanoma than I could ever acknowledge from colleagues across the country and across the Pacific. Jeff Gershenwald, if you made it back from France with my éclair, Merrick, Vern, and John, I want to thank each of you personally for the unique privilege of civilized debate. We don't agree with each other, but we know how to disagree. Closer to home, I've been surrounded by the smartest and most collegial melanoma group I could ever imagine, including Paul Chapman, Jed Wolchuk, Charlotte Arian, and Alan Halpern, among many others. There are three giants in this field without whom I would not be here today. The first is the late President Don Morton, whose dogged search for better methods to treat cancer patients, methods that he then subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny, truly established a standard of excellence and accomplishment for the rest of us. The next is Dr. Charles Balch. His achievements in introducing multivariable analysis of large databases to define the natural history of melanoma and in completing landmark clinical trials are legendary. I know of no other single individual, past or present, with as deep and enduring a personal commitment to our organization. Our journal, the Annals of Surgical Oncology, his vision and product, is the envy of the surgical oncology community. Charles, thank you so much for your advice and mentorship, and particularly for your friendship. And finally, of the three, Alan Houghton. Alan, who not all of you know, is the father of modern-day immunotherapy. And I'd like to dedicate my lecture to him today. Long before it was fashionable, Alan understood the immune system and believed in its power to control cancer. Actually, 34 years ago, it helped and actually taught me to make a mouse monoclonal antibody and then helped me to shepherd it into clinical trial. In that trial, it actually killed cancer cells. This is pretty impressive for a young surgical trainee. Throughout, never once through the scourge of ALS has his courage ever wavered, or has he ever lost his equanimity or support for the many he has mentored. More broadly on the home front, I would like to acknowledge the support and contribution of all of my MSKCC faculty colleagues, incompletely represented here and many too many to mention by name. This is not a wind beneath my wings type phenomenon, as it is rather that I would be quite fortunate to carry their luggage. I do want to, of the MSKCC colleagues, I do want to call out one very special individual, Alan David Mackay Turnbull, who's well known to so many of you former MSKCC fellows. He has joined us today for this very special occasion. Among his countless other contributions to my growth and development, Alan was actually kind enough on very short notice to take over service call from me on Christmas Day, 1995, to let me attend the birth of our first child. One of the greatest privileges of my career may have been the most unanticipated. Having been a surgical oncology fellow myself, I really had no idea of how rewarding and challenging it would be to interact with a succession of fellowship classes, each seemingly smarter and more accomplished than the one the year before. These amazing individuals did not come to MSKCC to work with me. I was simply lucky enough to be there when they arrived. And since that time, I've derived an unending visceral pride in all that they have accomplished in their post-MSKCC years. The future of surgical oncology has never been in better hands than it is today. There are two individuals who, for better or for worse, are largely responsible for who you see today. I met Blake Cady 40 years ago when I was a medical resident at the New England Deaconess Hospital, struggling with which side to part my hair on. I was immediately impressed by his often contrarian, but always evidence-based analytic mind. He was an evidence-based oncologist first and a superb technical surgeon second. Over the intervening decades, our professional relationship has matured into a friendship. As we've sailed all around the world, we can often be heard anchored in some remote Canadian maritime cove, loudly debating about the importance of surgical margins or regional lymph nodes, or even politics or the existence of God. We usually stop only when the ship's supply of rum has been exhausted. Finally, and it's hard for me to really acknowledge this, my recruitment dinner to MSKCC, contrary to most of you, was a cheeseburger at Katie Gallagher's bar with Murray Brennan. My contract after coffee was a simple handshake. What an extraordinary moment for a young surgeon. A handshake, a cheeseburger, and a handshake. Hundreds of you in this room will know what I mean when I say that no one who has ever met or worked with Murray has emerged from that experience unchanged. He leads by example, not by edict, and his humility is surpassed only by his extraordinarily razor-sharp intellect. His primary agenda throughout his entire career has been to advance others other than himself. His refrain, "It's not about me." Well, Murray, I hate to tell you, disagree with you one more time, but actually it is about you and what you've done for so many of us. You've allowed us to achieve so much more than we could have without you, and the debt we owe you is never going to be fully repaid, even as we try to do so by passing along some of the style and wisdom to future generations. Now, Murray has often, one of his other pieces of advice, he's often spoken about the challenge of making friends after 40 or 50 or 60. It has been my good fortune to prove him wrong on time and time again, as several of my professional relationships have subsequently blossomed into lifelong, deep personal friendships, which I expect will endure long after I have completed my final operation. If I could offer any advice to the unborn, it would be to pick your parents with great care. It certainly worked for me. My father was a secondary school teacher so devoted to and loved by his students that there was not a town in America where he would not be offered free room and board. By his example, he taught us independence and, most importantly, as Kelly mentioned, equanimity towards all. My mother was supremely organized, capable of raising 4 boisterous children while ensuring a home-cooked gourmet French meal on the table every night, yet still adventurous enough to go ocean sailing as a ship's cook when her child-rearing duties were done. And when my brothers and sister were being assigned, I got way better than I deserved. How do I know that? Every year we have a State of the Siblings weekend in Maine, and a few weeks ago, during our most recent one, I was explaining to them what I was going to be doing today, or trying to. And my sister Ann, who really gets to the point quickly, says, "Why weren't we invited?" And I had no really good answer, so here they all are in the front row. They put their very busy lives on hold to come out to Seattle and share today with me. There is no such thing as being too proud of your children. My kids are certainly no exception. The experience of watching David and Caroline grow into who they are today, gracious, smart, caring, engaged adults, and to see these 2 extraordinary people, Jackie and John, who they've chosen to be their partners in life, has given my life meaning beyond belief. And of course, as you've heard, none of this could have happened without Kate. The one true love and the epicenter of my universe. I could never in 1,000 lifetimes sufficiently acknowledge all of the sacrifices you have made to raise these extraordinary children, while at the same time indulging my passion for this life I chose. It is entirely because of you that I am here. Have you ever seen a more beautiful woman in your entire life? Okay, I am going to finish. Kate gets the top billing. So past President Al Cohen once described for me his outline for a good talk. He said, here's what I'm going to say, here's me saying it, and here's what I just said. So I'm going to return to the original premise of this address. I think most of the legendary giants in surgical oncology who preceded us would be reasonably pleased with how we have curated the opportunities we've been given. The absolute commitment to define the very best evidence-based and humane care for our patients, the dedication to equip the next generation of surgical oncologists with the tools to eclipse their mentors, and the passion to pursue the most innovative, rigorous, and disciplined clinical and basic science research to improve our understanding of the cancer enigma. These will always define the quintessence of our profession. We are now poised to leverage all of our achievements to date for the benefit of those less fortunate than ourselves. It will be a giant leap. I'm certain it would be worth it. I know Yogi would agree. Not done yet. I got a little more to go. Sorry, that was, yeah. I should have just stopped. But before I finish up, I've just got a couple of minutes. Take a look to your right and to your left. Every person in this room is here as the consummate result of a series of extraordinary accidents. the most miraculous of which is the accident of birth. Following that, through a consecutive series of additional accidents, coincidences, synchronicities, and opportunities, and yes, I'll even acknowledge a fair bit of preparation and hard work, we've achieved the extraordinary goal of calling ourselves surgical oncologists. All of us have earned the privilege of helping our patients and their families with capable and compassionate care through what is often the most very difficult challenge of their lives. However, when we participate in this enterprise, whether in patient care, research, or education, in exchange for the experience of being here, we all share this common responsibility to continue to add to the woodpile in whatever way we can. So as I finish up, I'd like to go back to Glenn Leake's initial address as he initiated this wonderful tradition 51 years ago. I doubt whether a president 50 years from now will ever bother to read these words. I feel they will mean so little, and he will think that we lived in a peculiar age and knew so very little about cancer. I hope, however, that he is as dedicated to the control of cancer and to the care of the cancer patient as those sitting here today. He goes on, and finally, I hope and pray that 50 years from now or sooner, there will be no president of the James Ewing Society and no need for the society because one of its members will have discovered the cause and another the cure for cancer. Until then, if I could suggest one motto for the society, I would borrow it from the Latin, optima futura, the best is yet to come. Dr. Leake, we did read your words 50 years later, and we understood that you did the best you could with the tools you had available at the time, as we have tried to do as well. Hopefully 50 years from now, future generations will similarly sympathize with what they will see as our rudimentary understanding of cancer, and they will share the same dedication to the mission that you had then and that we have now. And while I hope we will continue to unlock the secrets about the cause and cure of cancer, I fully expect there will be an SSO president 50 years from now whose presidential address will, as mine does today, echo your optimistic sentiments for the future. Members and guests, many, many friends and family, the opportunity to serve as your president this year has been the absolute apogee of what I consider to be an extraordinarily blessed professional life, and words alone cannot begin to express my extreme gratitude for the honor. Thank you very much.